January 3, 1943, 11 o'clock in the morning, 22,000 feet above the French coast. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines filled the thin, frozen air as Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene McGee hunched inside the cramped ball turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed Snap Crackle Pop. Through the plexiglass bubble beneath the bomber, he could see the Atlantic coast of Nazi-occupied France sliding past, 5 miles below. The temperature outside hovered at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his electrically heated flight suit, McGee was barely comfortable. What he could not know was that in the next 3 minutes he would fall from the sky without a parachute and survive to tell about it. The American formation, 85 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 8th Air Force, was approaching the most heavily defended target in occupied Europe, the port of Saint-Nazaire. German anti-aircraft gunners called the target Flak City. American bomber crews had a simpler name for it. They called it Hell. The mission was the 303rd Bomb Group's 9th combat operation, their 5th strike against Saint-Nazaire's massive submarine pens. These concrete fortresses housed German U-boats that were strangling Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The pens were nearly indestructible, built with reinforced concrete roofs 16 feet thick. So, the bombers aimed for the adjacent torpedo storage facilities instead. 24-year-old Alan McGee was flying his 7th combat mission. Born January 13, 1919 in Plainfield, New Jersey, he stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 155 pounds. He was barely small enough to fit into the ball turret, where a gunner's knees pressed against his chest in a space smaller than a phone booth. The position was considered the most dangerous on a B-17. German fighters targeted ball turret gunners first because they offered panoramic defensive fire. The bomber carrying McGee, serial number 4124620, belonged to the 360th Bomb Squadron. Its nose art showed 3 cartoon characters riding a 500-pound bomb. The Rice Krispies mascots Snap, Crackle, and Pop. The aircraft's pilot, Captain Jacob W. Fredericks, had worked for the Kellogg Company before the war. He had flown the bomber from the United States to England in October 1942. 10 men crewed the Flying Fortress that morning. Captain Arthur I. Adams, the pilot, was only 19 years old. Second Lieutenant Gene A. Witterstetter served as co-pilot. Second Lieutenant Michael L. Libinati, Jr. was the bombardier. Second Lieutenant Glenn M. Harrington navigated. Technical Sergeant Lewis C. Hart manned the top turret. Technical Sergeant Alfred M. Union operated the radio. Staff Sergeant Edward W. Durant and Sergeant Marvin L. Millam manned the waist guns. Staff Sergeant James I. Gordon sat in the tail turret, and Alan McGee crouched in the ball turret, scanning the sky below for German fighters. What the American bomber crews faced at Saint-Nazaire was unlike anything in modern warfare. The port bristled with anti-aircraft guns. The 22nd Naval Flak Brigade under Captain Zur See Karl Konrad Mecke commanded 43 guns ranging from 20mm to 40mm caliber. The 280th Naval Artillery Battalion added another 28 guns, including massive 280mm railway cannons. Approximately 5,000 German troops defended the immediate area. 20 to 30 German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, were scrambling to intercept. The Germans had developed a new tactic called predicted barrage. Instead of tracking individual bombers, they calculated the path the formation would fly and pre-positioned flak bursts along that route. The bombers would fly through a wall of exploding steel. There was no evasion, no maneuvering. The aircraft simply had to endure. Snap Crackle Pop held position in the left combat box, in the rightmost front position of the V formation. They were approximately 2 to 3 minutes from the target. The bomb bay doors were open. The bombardier was lining up his Norden bomb sight. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then the sky exploded. German flak burst directly in McGee's ball turret with a sound like a thunderclap. Shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin and ripped into his chest. Blood spattered across the plexiglass. The turret mechanism seized up, jammed by shrapnel damage. The smell of cordite and burning metal filled the cramped space. McGee knew he was badly wounded. He knew he had to get out. Ball turret gunners could not wear parachutes. There was simply no room. McGee had stored his chest parachute on the fuselage deck above the turret, standard procedure. Fighting shock and blood loss, he manually cranked open the turret hatch. Every turn of the hand crank sent pain shooting through his chest. He pulled himself up into the fuselage, desperate to reach his parachute before the bomber went down. His hands closed on the parachute pack. It felt wrong, too light. His fingers found a large hole torn completely through the middle. Flak fragments had shredded the silk canopy. The parachute was useless. At 20,000 feet over enemy territory with a dying aircraft around him, McGee had no way down. His training kicked in despite the shock. If his parachute was destroyed, maybe he could strap himself to another crew member. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Alfred M. Union was in the radio compartment forward. Perhaps Union's parachute could support them both for a tandem bailout. It was desperate, unlikely to work, but it was the only chance. McGee struggled forward through the fuselage, bleeding, fighting for breath in the thin air. Before he could reach Union, a second flak shell tore through the fuselage with explosive force. The concussion threw him against the interior wall. A massive hole opened in the side of the aircraft near the radio compartment, right where McGee was standing. Simultaneously, a German fighter attacked, probably a Focke-Wulf 4190, a 4 from the 2nd Squadron of Fighter Wing 2. 20mm cannon rounds hammered through the bomber's aluminum skin. A section of the right wing sheared away. Hydraulic fluid sprayed. Control cables snapped. The flying fortress shuddered like a mortally wounded animal. With part of its wing missing and control surfaces destroyed, Snap Crackle Pop rolled over and entered a violent death spiral. The bomber spun toward Earth, gyrating wildly as it plummeted. Inside, everything became chaos. Loose equipment flew through the cabin. Men tumbled helplessly. The aircraft was coming apart. McGee was already suffering from hypoxia, lack of oxygen at altitude, due to his chest wound. As the bomber spun, centrifugal force threw him around the fuselage like a rag doll. His consciousness was fading. Then, as the aircraft spun through the sky, he was violently ejected through the hole made by the second flak hit. One moment he was inside a dying bomber. The next, he was in open sky, 4 miles above Nazi-occupied France, falling at terminal velocity without a parachute. According to reports from the 303rd Bomb Group, McGee briefly regained consciousness during his fall. For a few horrifying seconds, he was aware. Falling at approximately 120 miles per hour through freezing winter air, the ground impossibly far below, wind screaming past, knowing he had no parachute. In those moments of absolute terror, he spoke a prayer. "I don't wish to die because I know nothing of life." Then hypoxia claimed him again. He lost consciousness, tumbling unconscious through 20,000 feet of empty air. He would fall for approximately 2 to 2.5 minutes before impact. The physics of what was happening to McGee's body were straightforward and fatal. When a human being falls from rest, they accelerate at approximately 9.8 meters per second squared due to gravity. Within 12 seconds, falling approximately 450 meters, McGee would have reached terminal velocity. For an average-sized male in an unstable tumbling position, terminal velocity is approximately 120 miles per hour. That is 193 kilometers per hour, or 53.6 meters per second. When McGee's body would strike the ground at 120 miles per hour, his kinetic energy would be approximately 100,000 joules. That is equivalent to a small car hitting a wall at 40 miles per hour. That energy had to be dissipated in less than 1 second. Instant stop equals instant death. Every aviator knew this. Every physicist could calculate it. Falling from 20,000 feet without a parachute was absolutely, certainly, mathematically fatal. Except that morning in Saint Nazaire, the mathematics were about to encounter something unexpected: the Saint Nazaire railway station. The station featured typical 19th century French railway architecture. A large glass skylight and canopy covered the platforms, supported by ornate steel girders and framework. Multiple thick glass panes were set in metal frames. This Victorian-era iron and glass construction was designed for beauty and natural light. Nobody had ever imagined it might save a man's life. McGee's unconscious body struck the glass roof at approximately 120 miles per hour. The impact produced a sound described by witnesses as a massive shattering, an explosive crash that echoed through the station. But instead of stopping instantly against concrete or steel, which would have killed him immediately, McGee's body crashed through multiple sequential glass panes. Each pane absorbed energy through elastic deformation before fracture, crack propagation, and fragment dispersion. The glass roof functioned as an improvised multi-stage deceleration system, similar to a modern crumple zone in automobiles. Each breaking pane consumed energy through material failure, extending McGee's stopping time from microseconds, which would be fatal, to approximately 50 to 100 milliseconds, which was barely survivable. After penetrating through the glass layers, McGee's body struck the steel girders and framework supporting the roof. These provided the final deceleration stage, absorbing the remaining kinetic energy through structural deflection. German soldiers stationed at or near the railway station found him unconscious, draped over the steel girders that arched above the railway tracks, hanging from the roof structure. He was still alive. With a stopping distance of approximately 1 to 2 meters through the roof structure, McGee experienced an average deceleration of approximately 1,400 meters per second squared, roughly 147 times the force of gravity. Peak forces likely exceeded 200 Gs for brief milliseconds. But the progressive breaking of multiple glass panes distributed this over time, rather than creating a single catastrophic instant stop. That distribution, that spreading of the impact over 50 to 100 milliseconds instead of 1 millisecond, was the difference between death and survival. Why did he survive when physics said he should not? 4 critical factors aligned that morning. First, the glass roof. Unlike concrete or steel, which provides instant deceleration and certain death, glass breaks progressively. Each shattering pane consumed energy. This factor alone accounted for approximately 85% of his survival probability. Second, unconsciousness. McGee's hypoxia-induced unconsciousness paradoxically saved his life. Conscious falling victims tense their muscles and lock their joints in anticipation of impact, making bones brittle and prone to catastrophic fracture. Unconscious bodies remain relaxed and flexible, allowing better energy distribution across the skeletal system. This relaxed body phenomenon is well documented in trauma literature. Drunk or unconscious victims often sustain fewer fatal injuries than conscious victims in similar accidents. Third, body position. McGee's tumbling unconscious fall meant he struck the roof at an angle rather than flat horizontal impact. Multiple body parts contacted the structure sequentially, likely feet and legs first, then torso, then arms. This distributed the impact force across his skeleton rather than concentrating it at a single point. Fourth, immediate medical care. Survival from impact was only the first hurdle. With catastrophic injuries causing massive hemorrhaging, McGee would have died from blood loss within minutes without immediate intervention. As German soldiers carried him to medical facilities, McGee regained consciousness. His first words were, "Thank God I'm alive." The Germans were astonished. They had never seen anyone survive such a fall. According to later accounts, the Germans decided that anyone who could miraculously survive deserved real special attention. McGee was taken to the Hermitage Hotel in Saint-Nazaire, converted for German military use. A German military doctor examined his injuries. They were catastrophic. His right arm was nearly severed from his body, hanging by tissue and tendons. His right leg was broken. His right ankle was broken. His right knee was badly damaged. He had 28 shrapnel and glass wounds throughout his body. His nose was broken. He had severe eye damage with a torn eyelid. His teeth were broken. His lung was punctured, causing difficulty breathing. His kidney was damaged with internal bleeding. He had multiple rib fractures and extensive internal hemorrhaging. Using modern trauma scoring systems, McGee's injury severity score would be 35 to 40 plus, classified as severe with high mortality risk. Even with modern medical care, survival probability with these injuries would be less than 50%. In 1943, with limited antibiotics and surgical capabilities, his survival was extraordinary. The German military doctor looked at McGee's nearly severed right arm and said, "We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm." True to his word, the doctor successfully saved McGee's arm through skillful surgery. He also treated the punctured lung, kidney damage, multiple fractures, facial trauma, and 28 separate wounds. The surgery lasted hours. Years later, McGee stated, "I owe the German military doctor who treated me a debt of gratitude. He told me we are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm." The doctor, whose name I never found out, saved my arm and also took care of my multitude of injuries. The doctor's name was never discovered. It remains unknown whether he survived the war. His adherence to the Hippocratic Oath, choosing medical ethics over wartime enmity, saved McGee's life and arm. While McGee was receiving emergency surgery, the bomber he had fallen from crashed in the forest of La Baule-Escoublac, approximately 6 miles west of Saint-Nazaire. 7 of the 10 crew members were killed. Only 3 survived. Second, Lieutenant Glenn M. Harrington, the navigator, was wounded by enemy gunfire and lost his leg. He parachuted into waters offshore Saint-Nazaire and was rescued by Germans. His leg was amputated at a Luftwaffe hospital. He became a prisoner of war and died in 1987. Staff Sergeant James I. Gordon, the tail gunner, parachuted into the water and was assisted ashore by French civilians before German capture. He survived without serious injury and became a prisoner of war. And Alan McGee survived a fall that should have killed him instantly. The mission results that day were grim. Of 85 B-17 bombers dispatched, 7 were shot down. That was an 8% loss rate versus the typical 5% for 1943. 47 aircraft returned damaged. Approximately 70 to 75 American airmen were lost. The mission was deemed only moderately successful. The concrete reinforced U-boat pens were nearly impervious to bombing. In 1942 to 1943, it was statistically impossible for bomber crews to complete the required 25-mission tour. Average B-17 life expectancy in late 1943 was only 11 missions. Only 35% of crews flying the original 25-mission tours in 1942 to 1943 survived. 77% of American airmen who flew against Germany before D-Day became casualties. Ball turret gunners had the highest casualty rate of any position. German fighters targeted them first. After sufficient recovery from his initial injuries, McGee was transferred to Stalag 17B in Austria. This was one of the most notorious prisoner of war camps, housing up to 4,200 American airmen. Conditions were harsh. Inadequate food, leading to severe malnutrition. Poor hygiene with rampant disease. Brutal treatment by guards. Many prisoners lost nearly half their body weight. McGee remained a prisoner of war from January 3, 1943, until liberation in May 1945, over 2 years of captivity. In May 1945, Allied forces liberated Stalag 17B. McGee returned home to the United States, having survived not only the impossible fall, but also more than 2 years in one of Nazi Germany's harshest prisoner of war camps. Upon liberation and return, McGee received the Air Medal for meritorious conduct, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and the Prisoner of War Medal. Despite his harrowing experience, McGee's love of flight was undiminished. In 1946, he earned his pilot's license. The young man who fell 4 miles without a parachute returned to the skies voluntarily. He worked in the airline industry in various roles. He married Helen. He retired in 1979. He moved to northern New Mexico, later to San Angelo, Texas. He died December 20, 2003, from stroke and kidney failure at age 84. His body was cremated and buried at Pioneer Memorial Park in Texas. His friend Don Jenkins knew McGee for 38 years. Jenkins said McGee was very easy to get along with, very cheerful, very talkative, and a very, very sweet guy. Alan was never the type to look in the past. He always was looking forward, living for the moment. Jenkins said McGee led a pretty good life. He hiked, backpacked, and lived for the enjoyment of each moment. After the war, McGee did not discuss his ordeal or his survival story with anyone. During almost 40 years of friendship, McGee only spoke about the incident 3 times, according to Jenkins. When someone asked McGee to discuss the incident before a memorial ceremony, Alan wasn't interested in discussing this. However, he did acknowledge, "God was certainly looking out for me." In later years, McGee would sum up his survival with simple faith. "I don't know how I got there, but here I am, thanks to God." On January 3, 1993, the 50th anniversary of the incident, The people of Saint-Nazaire erected a memorial to commemorate the crew of Snap Crackle Pop at the crash site in La Baule-Escoublac Forest. McGee attended as guest of honor. The townspeople hosted a banquet honoring the crew. Jenkins noted he was very excited and honored. On September 23 and 24, 1995, McGee returned to Saint-Nazaire with his wife Helen. A memorial mass was held for the 7 killed aviators. The entourage proceeded to the crash site where McGee planted a tree of peace. The memorial was uncovered and dedicated, decorated with many wreaths. The next day, McGee visited the United States Military Cemetery at St. James in Normandy. He paid his respects at the graves of his crewmates: Lieutenant Witterstetter, Technical Sergeant Hart, Technical Sergeant Union, Sergeant Milam, Staff Sergeant Durant, 5 of his friends who did not come home. During their stay, McGee visited the Hermitage Hotel where he was treated 52 years earlier. He visited the submarine pens, the harbor, and he visited the ancient railroad station with its glass roof, the site of his miraculous landing. When McGee viewed the railroad station's glass roof for the first time consciously, he had been unconscious during his actual landing, he said, "I thought it was much smaller." McGee was named Citizen of Honor of Saint-Nazaire by the town's mayor. Extraordinary recognition for an enemy combatant who had participated in raids that destroyed 90% of the city. Michel Luguez, the French memorial organizer, explained the profound gratitude. It should be repeated that Saint-Nazaire was 90% destroyed. Also, numerous citizens were deported to the concentration camps or shot while helping United States aviators evade the enemy in their efforts to get to Spain to rejoin their units back in England. Also, the landing in Normandy and our liberation by the United States Army and Allied troops was very much appreciated by the local population. In November 1981, Smithsonian Magazine featured McGee's story as one of the 10 most amazing survival stories of World War II. The television show Mythbusters later investigated theories about his survival, concluding the glass roof alone provided sufficient explanation without requiring additional factors like bomb blast shockwaves. McGee's fall represents one of several documented cases of survival from extreme altitude without a parachute. British Royal Air Force Sergeant Nicholas Alcamaide fell 18,000 feet from an Avro Lancaster bomber in 1944 when his parachute caught fire. He landed in fir trees and deep snow with only a sprained leg. Soviet Air Force Lieutenant Ivan Chisov fell 21,000 to 23,000 feet from an Ilyushin Il-4 bomber in 1942. He passed out from hypoxia and landed on the edge of a snowy ravine. He suffered broken bones but was back flying within 3 months. Serbian flight attendant Vesna Vulovic holds the Guinness World Record, falling 33,333 feet when a DC-9 passenger jet exploded in 1972. She remained trapped in the tail section and landed in snow-covered mountain forest. Common survival factors across all cases include deceleration extension through snow, trees, glass, or contained fuselage. Distributed impact across multiple contact points, unconsciousness or relaxation at impact, young age and physical fitness, immediate medical care, and an element of chance in precise impact angle and surface characteristics. McGee's case is unique as the only documented survival involving crashing through a building structure rather than natural terrain. The survival violated every expectation. Physics said death, medicine said death, statistics said death. Yet the precise alignment of glass breaking at the right angle, unconsciousness providing relaxed muscles, German medical ethics overcoming wartime hatred, and young human resilience created the narrow corridor through which one 24-year-old ball turret gunner passed from certain death to improbable life. The memorial stands today near the crash site in La Baule-Escoublac Forest, approximately 6 miles west of Saint-Nazaire. It consists of a rough gray vertical stone monument on a tile walkway with a black plaque bearing gold lettering commemorating American aviators alongside McGee's planted tree of peace. 7 men died that day in January 1940. 3. Captain Arthur I. Adams, 19 years old. 2nd Lieutenant Gene A. Witterstetter. 2nd Lieutenant Michael L. Libonati, Jr. Technical Sergeant Lewis C. Hart. Technical Sergeant Alfred M. Union. Staff Sergeant Edward W. Durant. Sergeant Marvin L. Milam. Their bomber, Snap Crackle Pop, crashed in flames in a French forest. The Germans recovered the nose art, showing the 3 Rice Krispies mascots, and displayed it as a war trophy. At war's end, they threw it off a cliff. It was later found on the rocks below, restored in 1989, and preserved as a memorial. Alan McGee lived 60 more years after that January morning. He earned his pilot's license and returned to the skies. He worked in aviation. He married. He hiked and backpacked. He lived for the enjoyment of each moment. He planted a tree of peace where his friends died. He returned to the train station that saved his life and said he thought it was much smaller. He lived to age 84, dying peacefully in 2003. When asked about his impossible survival, McGee offered no dramatic theories or complicated explanations. His answer was simple: "I don't know how I got there, but here I am, thanks to God." The miracle was not just surviving the fall. The miracle was choosing to fly again. The miracle was living fully despite knowing intimately how fragile life is. The miracle was gratitude. For the German doctor whose name he never learned. For the French people who honored fallen enemies as liberators. For each day he opened his eyes and was still here. The mathematics said he should have died. Terminal velocity, kinetic energy, G-forces, impact trauma. But mathematics encountered something it could not calculate: the random intersection of glass architecture and falling man. The unconsciousness that relaxed his body at the critical moment. The doctor who chose healing over hatred. The young body that refused to quit. Alan Eugene McGee fell 22,000 feet without a parachute and lived. He spent 2 years in a brutal prisoner of war camp and survived. He returned home. He earned his pilot's license. He worked, he loved, he laughed. He planted a tree. He lived to be 84. And for 60 years after the day he should have died, Alan McGee walked the earth as living proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible happens. Not because we understand it, not because we can explain it, but because, in the vast mathematics of war and death and falling, occasionally the numbers align in a way that allows one man to crash through a train station roof at 120 miles per hour and somehow, impossibly, walk away. The train station roof still stands in Saint-Nazaire. The memorial marks the forest where the bomber fell. The tree of peace grows where 7 men died. And the story endures as a reminder that courage, chance, and grace can sometimes bend the unbendable rules of physics and grant one more sunrise to a man who fell from the sky.